Okay, hello and welcome everyone to the York Festival of Ideas. My name is Lorraine Working. I'm a lecturer in the English department at the University of York, and I will be chairing the event today. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon. And now I would just like to introduce our speaker, Anna Whitelock. So Anna is a historian, author, and broadcaster. She specialized in the topics of monarchy, public history and heritage, and the Tudors and Stuarts. She's written multiple books. I'm sure many of you have read them already, as well as news articles on these subjects. She's currently Professor of the History of Monarchy at City St. George's, University of London. Her most recent book is why we're here today, to hear her speak about the sun rising, which offers a panoramic history of the arrival of the Stuarts and explains how the reign of King James I saw England reach new corners of the globe. The book really provides, I think, a kaleidoscopic snapshot of English interests in, and gives us a kind of truly global picture of the Stuarts. So there's chapters on Virginia, on Persia, on Ireland, Russia, right? So we're really getting a sense of how global developments in this period are tied to a history that I think we don't always tend to associate with globalization. And we're really delighted that Anna is joining us as well after the talk to sign her book, James I and the Dawn of a Global Britain. So do buy one of her books at the end and have her sign it. So Anna, over to you.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much for coming to hear about the sun rising when in fact the sun is arisen outside. So I'm very honoured that you're here. I'm also genuinely delighted and honoured that Lorraine is introducing and chairing this event, because actually I'm a big fan of hers. She is too humble to tell you, but she's got a book coming out next month, which in the conversation afterwards I hope we can just talk a little bit about, because it's actually very timely. It reflects, it's talking about really the impact of America on Tudor and Stuart England, and so feels quite timely in lots of ways and picks up some of the echoes of the sorts of things that I was looking at in my book, the sort of reflections of, or the roots of the present in the past. Lorraine also wrote a fantastic book on the making of an imperial polity, Jacobean London, so I was very influenced by her work when I was writing this. I'm delighted that you're here, and you should definitely look out for her book, The Golden World, which, as I say, is coming out next month. So, first of all, to talk a little bit about my book and the writing of it. And you may be aware, I had previously written Mary Tudor and Elizabeth's Bedfellows. And so I set about really thinking, okay, well, I'm just going to write the third in the sort of trilogy, if you like, and pick up with the story of the death of Elizabeth and the arrival of James. I had a brilliant title, I thought, Succession. I don't know, somone will probably use that. And so, yeah, exactly. And I thought, you know what? People, the minute that Elizabeth I kind of, dies, it's if like the interest in the monarchy just goes. There's so much interest in the Tudors, but actually, what about the arrival of James? A king with a young family. And I was going to talk about the arrival of this new royal family from Scotland in England and the establishment of the dynasty and the court. But, even though historians like us, we're very much thinking about the past, we're also influenced by the present. And this book's been long in the making, and it really evolved through lots of things that were happening in our own sort of geopolitics. The Scottish referendum, Brexit, discussions about Britain's place in the world, Britain's sort of national identity crisis, if you like. And I began to think that a book that was purely focused on the English court somehow didn't kind of meet the moment. I felt like history needed to try and speak to the moment that we are in. And so I thought, well, actually, let's just think about this. How about if we thought about James's reign from a more global perspective? I mean, what were people thinking about England at this point? What was James trying to do in a much bigger canvas that wasn't simply England? And if we think about the early 17th century, we can actually see it as a really seminal moment for the making of modern Britain, and its relations with the wider world. It was important for the forging of mentalities, of national identities, and of our relations between countries and continents. Trade at this point became global. Britain and just as I'll talk about, England and Scotland came together under James to create this fledgling Great Britain that was pushed out over across the world, really. And as we're going to see, Britain at this point had a sort of sense of sort of delusion about its own significance and its power and its magnificence at the time. So let's then pick up the story, let's pick up the story in 1603. Elizabeth lay dying. This is a later 19th century depiction of her. She lay on cushions in her bedchamber, which is pretty much where my bedfellows book ended. She didn't want to be carried to bed because she knew that when she went to bed it would be her deathbed. So very reluctant to go to bed. And this picture there is a picture that managed to escape pretty much the official censorship that showed Elizabeth aging. The Mask of Youth was how you were supposed to depict Elizabeth, but this one slipped through the net. And so in the weeks and months and indeed years before Elizabeth died, there'd been all kinds of secret communications with Scotland, with James, and with the continent about who was going to succeed Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth, who often, comes in the polls of one of our greatest Britons, I would argue, separate conversation, was one of the most overrated monarchs in British history. I know, we can have that debate. But she made no attempt to preserve the succession, which is the big thing you have to do as a monarch. Even the late Queen Elizabeth II was very, very proud of the fact that she had the future sorted out. If you think about one of the last appearances of Elizabeth II on the balcony for her Platinum Jubilee, there she was with the next 3 generations. It was a big deal. It was a big deal then. It was an even bigger deal under Elizabeth I when we were in a personal monarchy, political power centred on the monarch. Elizabeth didn't marry. Elizabeth then refused to name an heir, thinking that attention would move to the rising rather than the setting sun. And so there was all kinds of anxieties that England was going to be plunged into civil war. And so as she became more and more ill, the ports were blockaded, treasure was put in the Tower of London. There was actually a plague going on, talk about echoes with the present. The theatres were closed, there was a real sense of lockdown. And secret messages had been passed between Scotland and England, between Robert Cecil and King James, basically saying, look, just bide your time, it will be okay. But of course, it seemed a remarkable notion that Scotland, England's old enemy, was going to give England its next monarch. But as it turned out, pot spoiler, Elizabeth dies, there is a smooth succession, and James I inherits the throne. A Scottish king, after very many years of an unmarried Queen Elizabeth I. James was 58 years old. He'd been King of Scotland since an infant. He was married to Anna of Denmark, and he had 3 children depicted here when they were older. But at the time, Prince Henry, who was 8, Princess Elizabeth, who was 6, and Prince Charles, who was just 2 years old. James had ruled Scotland pretty effectively, putting down feuding factions in politics and in the church. He was, of course, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. For a time, he'd been captured and held prisoner, but over time, he'd managed to assert his control in Scotland. But in 1603, it was an uneasy inheritance. England and Scotland had long been old enemies, and England had been living beyond its means for decades. Since the break with Rome, which historians have described as Britain's first Brexit, kind of breaking with this big supra-European institution that people used to pay money to, that had laws and so on and so on and so on. It's actually, it's an awkward parallel, but it's not a completely ridiculous one. Since the break with Rome and then the long war with Spain, which of course climaxed with the sending of the Spanish Armada, England had been cut off from Catholic Europe, and that had come at great cost, not least for trade. The European markets were closed off to English broadcloth, which was the heavy textile that was our main export at the time. And there was also a very awkward, uneasy relationship between Catholic Europe and between England. James very much sought to reset that. England was also playing catch-up internationally and lagged well behind the Spanish and Portuguese in the race to colonise what was referred to as the New World. Despite the efforts of Elizabethan adventurers, England had no colonial possessions, had failed to discover sources of wealth, such as South American silver or Asian spices, that swelled the coffers in Spain and Portugal, and which latterly had sparked the rapid commercial growth of the Dutch. The Dutch is a phenomenal story at this point. They also had an East India Company. They were a significant commercial rival. Now, in 1603, James, if you like, had sort of two main policies. The first was his British project. He wanted to achieve a perfect union of the realms of England and Scotland. He wanted a new British coinage, a new flag, and he wanted to establish birthright citizenship. In other words, that people who were born in Scotland would also have rights to James's realm, so in England too. And this proved to be something that through a court case, this was established in 1606, the concept of birthright citizenship, which of course has a lineage which we can then trace from then right through to today. Ireland was to remain a separate kingdom, but James sought control and symmetry with the mainland, and in 1609 he sponsored a plantation. People have described it as a kind of the first sort of colonial experiment, a kind of laboratory for colonialism, which I'm sure Lorraine has some thoughts about. And he sponsored the plantation of Scots and English in Ulster in order to make Ireland British, with great violence and tragedy. Now, as you might imagine, perhaps, these propositions to just unite England and Scotland were not popular and faced stiff opposition both in London and Edinburgh. There was all kinds of, obviously, separate coinage, separate laws, and the idea that there would now be sort of common laws and institutions was really resisted. As I said, James had to turn to the courts to get his, to achieve the birthright citizenship that he wanted. And effectively, after many, many debates in Parliament, and the debates are really interesting, and when people were talking at the time of the Scottish referendum, I mean, just some of the rhetoric about the Scots, I mean, it really did, if you look back at the debates in Parliament at the time, the assumptions that the Scots were, would take English jobs, that they were somehow an inferior people. I mean, really it was kind of very colourful, the depictions of the English and the Scots, and ultimately Parliament resisted this idea of this perfect union. And so by royal prerogative, James established what he wanted. He got his coins, and he ultimately created, after a number of, and you can see here, various designs which ultimately got to the Union Jack. And of course the Union Jack referring to James, Latin Jacobus, established in James's reign. And James proclaimed himself King of Great Britain. So from this point on, we see in correspondence that's going overseas, James describing himself as King of Great Britain. The other great project that James wanted to set about achieving when he became king was European peace. He wanted to not only establish peace again between England and the continent, and of course, as I alluded to, England and Spain, Elizabeth and Philip II in particular, the Spanish Armada. That war, which had been going on for 18 years, had come at such a high price. James wanted for peace to be restored. Scotland had never been drawn into that war, and James saw himself very much as a kind of peacemaker figure that could balance factions. And, the fact that James, who was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, but married to a Danish and Lutheran-born Anna of Denmark, gave this sense that he certainly suggested that he was sort of all things to all people. And this was a motif that came up a lot. The book's just come out in America, and Lauren will probably may recognise this when I'm sure with her book on the influence of America. But the publishers are like, "So, where's the Trump angle?" And I'm like, I'm not kind of sure there is one, really. But they're like, no, there will be, because we're looking for the Trump angle. And I was initially dismissed the question. But as I began to think about it, I was just like, actually, James is trying to assert this image of Britain as Great Britain. Never mind make America great again. And so he does have this sense of promising all things to all people. When people describe Trump, is it sort of sofa diplomacy, where he kind of like says yes to whoever's last sort of made an imprint on his sofa having sat there? To some extent, James was a bit like that. No one quite knew where they stood with him, and ambassadors would sort of, say he just promises all things to all people and doesn't ever really deliver. And that was sort of seen as one of James's great strengths, but also became something that European princes in particular found very difficult. But James certainly saw himself as Rex Pacificus, the peacemaker of Europe. And very quickly in the reign, talks were begun with Spain, Somerset House Conference, which of course brought about peace between England and Spain in the Treaty of London. And James, through vigorous lobbying of the Spanish King Philip III, managed to achieve a 30% drop in tariffs on imports into Spain. So, Philip III had these kind of crazy, if Trumpian plans, if you like, to impose tariffs. And James, under a lot of pressure from merchants who were like, you've got to sort of support us in allowing us to rebuild those trading links with Europe. And so the Treaty of London was achieved, although it's important to say at this point, and because of the break with Rome, increasingly merchants had looked further afield. They'd wanted to extend trade routes beyond Europe and to the east, and that became the big drive that we see from this point onwards. And the model was the joint stock company, so which basically raised capital. It raised its own capital. People would invest in it rather than it being directly supported and funded by the crown. And so there's lots of examples of this. So in 1592, the Levant Company was set up for trade with Turkey. The East India Company, 1601, so just at the end of the reign of Elizabeth I. And 1606, the Virginia Company. And one of the things that I really began to explore in the book is just the significance of these trading companies for sort of moving the image, the status, the sort of power, the assertion of power of Britain out into the world. And, so a figure, for example, like Sir Thomas Smith, who's pictured there at the top corner, he was an incredible, he was a remarkable figure that really hasn't found his way into really popular tellings of the reign. He was a merchant, he was a politician, he was the first governor of the East India Company, he was the treasurer of the Virginia Company, he was involved with the Muscovy Company that was trading with Russia. He'd been involved in all kinds of ventures to try and find a sea route over the top of America. So basically, round the Cape of Good Hope, that had already been discovered by the Spanish Portuguese. And so there was this quest by the English to try and find an alternative trading route over the top of America, totally perilous through Arctic waters. And I talk in the book about some of the attempts to find that trading route to the east. Just a remarkable, what people were prepared to do in this sort of cause of discovery and the prospect of wealth, really, and new opportunities. James sort of had an interesting relationship with these companies. He would be keen to profit from them, primarily through customs duties, especially on silk and pepper and tobacco, which of course he absolutely hated. But as Loren's book really shows, ultimately, of course, tobacco becomes the thing that becomes profitable. So James, having written the counterblast against tobacco, he was, anti-tobacco before everyone else. But ultimately, it was the thing that really bailed out England at a time when it really needed to make some money out of the colonies. So merchants set sail around the world with the new Union flag, on their boats. And alongside these merchant voyages, increasingly, they would carry letters from James. Letters to princes, to kings and emperors of the world, which the merchants would hopefully be able to, well, first of all, reach those lands, but then introduce themselves to the rulers of those lands, looking for permission to trade, but also telling them about their great king. So here we've got the emperor, pictured of the Emperor of Japan, Shah of Persia, Emperor of Mughal India. And these were countries that each of them has a sort of chapter in the book that the merchants, the adventurers would, from Jacobean London, would push beyond the shores and out to try and find new trading links. And one example, just to sort of dwell on for a minute, which in a way I think illustrates the kind of attitude of the English at times, of James. And I mean, it was the beginning of me thinking, this is, this differing perspective of England. And so often, the Tudors and Stuarts have been written, as I say, from this Anglo-centric perspective, or perhaps even with Europe as well. And we begin to think that, they were really significant in the world. And what I try to show in my book is actually not really at all. And I think the encounter with Mughal India really illustrates that. So James decided that when a voyage was going to be sent to India with the East India Company, he was going to appoint one of their chief sort of merchants was also going to be his ambassador. So we see for the first time the King of Great Britain appointing an ambassador to India. So pub quiz question. First ambassador to England, Thomas Roe. So he was appointed by James, and he had this, there he is, and he had, quite the task. He had to, go and establish trading, permission to trade, really, on behalf of the East India Company and James, but also assert the magnificence, the mightiness of James. And so James, drafted a letter, and the letter talked about how, James was the mightiest king, he was feared, across the oceans and all of this kind of thing. And so there we go, Thomas Roe off to India. Now, in the early 17th century, the Mughal Empire was among the richest and most powerful empires in the world, covering northern and central India, modern-day Afghanistan, much of western Pakistan. So, I mean, we're talking huge, and the Mughals were a dynasty that reigned from 16th to the 19th century. The emperor ruled over about 100 million subjects. There were cities which, dwarfed those in Europe in terms of size, splendor, and wealth. I mean, and it really was, reading about this, just suddenly you just think, wow, we were nothing. We really were nothing. So in 1615, as I say, the first ever official ambassador goes to India, sent by James, Thomas Roe, from Kent. He'd ingratiated himself with James's family. He was he was quite close to the king's children. And so off he goes to India with the job to establish a permanent trade treaty on behalf of the East India Company, but also convinced the Indian emperor that the King of Great Britain, quote, and this is the letter that was drafted for him, wielded such power and strength at sea, which gives us not only reputation and authority among the greatest princes of Christendom, but making us even a terror to all nations. So this was, who James thought he was and how he was asking to be presented. He was also being asked to demonstrate that he was benevolent, he was a loved monarch, who was not only absolutely obeyed, but universally beloved and admired of all people. This was the rhetoric in the letter. So Roe was to convince the emperor of the importance of Britain as a European power worthy of a permanent and formal trading agreement. On neither account did it go to plan. When the ambassador arrived there, he had his first audience with the emperor, the 47-year-old emperor. The emperor was, polite. He accepted the letter from James. He also accepted the presents that had been given. So presents were a massive thing, which was a way to ingratiate yourself. Now, you might think present sounds pretty cool. He got an English carriage, horses, coachmen, and a carriage, and various scarves and swords and stuff. So, Thomas Rowe thinks, job done, I've presented this, he seemed to like it, that's kind of okay. But as Thomas Rowe describes, and there's lots and lots of letters, and that was something that was so brilliant about the Stuart period. Actually, you might think, well, how do we kind of get access to all of this kind of global canvas? The letters that were sent back from merchants, particularly in the East India Company, I mean, they are really, really rich, not least because it took such a long time for, so you're looking at kind of a year and a half. So everything was very delayed, but everything was described in minute detail. But it also meant that by the time things arrived in India, goods, gifts became quite tarnished or rotten or just not good enough. And so when Thomas Rowe went back to the court next time, he saw the English coachman and he saw the coach, but he also saw that the coach had been redressed in sumptuous fabrics, basically had been upgraded. So the brass nails had been replaced by silver nails, and the velvet had been replaced by ground silver and silk. So in other words, yeah, thanks, but we'll upgrade it, upcycle it. And so, I mean, I think in a way that for me is just a perfect kind of example of the deluded sense of the English and, where we were in the kind of pecking order. That said, I mean, if we believe Thomas Rowe, he did say, when writing back, and he was always bigging himself up, everything's under control, the trade treaty's coming, not a bit of it. But he did say, they, the Indians, imitate everything we bring and embroider now as well as we are. So he believed that, he said they even looked to employ British workers. And Rowe wrote that the emperor had requested him to provide a pattern of a quiver and a case for my bow, a coat to wear and a cushion. So according to Rowe, actually, he really did like the sort of embroidery and the workmanship from England and wanted workers and patterns. Now, whether in fact that was Rowe trying to big up his influence or not, the very fact remained that Rowe achieved effectively nothing. The emperor saw no point in a trade treaty with England. We were too inferior, too insignificant, too weak. And despite Rowe's very great efforts, it came to nothing. So just going to quickly whistle through a couple of things, then we'll have some conversation. So away from the challenges of commerce and the relentless drive for new markets and profitable trade, Britain continued to attempt to extend its global reach into new parts of the world, encouraging people from all manner of backgrounds willing to move to distant shores for a new life. And this was part of the king's idea of creating a new Britain abroad. So again, this idea that colonies would be a new Britain abroad, and also that they would fulfill a civilizing mission, that they would convert the heathens to Christianity. I mean, just to pause for a second and think about the sort of mindset of people who really did sort of pack up their belongings, their lives, and travel to unknown shores. I mean, it's really quite remarkable, really, that people did that without a really clear sense of what was going to be, what they were going to meet at the end of it. And actually, so the Virginia colonies pictured here, and then, of course, the Puritan Plymouth colony in Massachusetts Bay in 1620. So the book some of you will be familiar with the Mayflower, so this is also described in the book. But these drives to go to the New World, driven by a desire to find that route to a route to Asia through the Northwest Passage, but also to convert the heathen and to find new natural resources, raw materials. Now, the early years in the colonies were really hard. I mean, and again, we can perhaps talk about this. It's very difficult to write about. I mean, because of course, the source material that's left is very one-sided, but the violence, the atrocity, the very fraught relations with the Native American inhabitants is really, really difficult. And the early years were all about massive setbacks, famines, disease, reports coming back to London that, the colonies, people are just dying in the colonies, but this big PR push in London, people like John Donne giving speeches, giving sermons, encouraging people to either invest in the companies, there was a national lottery to try and raise money for the colonies, or indeed to go and settle there themselves. In 1609, as it's depicted here, this promotional booklet, Nova Britannia, New Britain, offering most excellent fruits by planting in Virginia. And it emphasised that Virginia was a national project to create a new Britain, a colony that would glorify God and the king. Of course, the reality was huge suffering, atrocities, really on a quite unimaginable scale. Also in the book, again, these little bits of things that I kind of knew in a sort of peripheral view, but were managed to weave into the book. Pocahontas, who some of you will know. Pocahontas, an Indian princess, she married an English tobacco farmer, was brought to England in this period in London, effectively to go on a kind of promotional tour as the sort of pin-up girl, for want of a better term, of a successful colony. She'd converted to Christianity, she'd married an Englishman, they had a son, and so she basically toured around London. And then very, very tragically on her, just as she was to depart, she died of tuberculosis. But that in itself was a really interesting episode with Pocahontas. There's lots and lots of, I referred to the source material from the East India Company, but we also have in this period lots of diaries, lots of travel accounts, because with peace with the continent, young men, and it was young men predominantly, who would start to travel for the first time, go on sort of gap years, as well as, of course, people travelling and settling in the New World. And we also see in this period an unprecedented growth in interest in foreign affairs, the emergence of the first news sheets, which effectively became newspapers. So St Paul's in London, in the sort of outside St Paul's Cathedral, the churchyard would be where, pamphlets would be produced, and they began to be daily pamphlets of news on the continent. And very interestingly, that was the drive for more interest in news. It wasn't domestic affairs, it was actually what was going on in Europe, particularly the war between Protestants and Catholics, and the English wanting to support Protestants in Europe. So the rise of newspapers is really interesting in this at this period. Now, James, as I said, wanted to promote himself as a peacemaker. And one of the ways in which he sought to do that was by using his children. I should say Prince Henry died prematurely. Massive national mourning. I mean, under sort of 18-year-old, the hopes of so many people as this sort of dashing, chivalrous future king, he died. And James decided to attempt to broker peace in Europe between Catholics and Protestants by marrying his children to Protestant Catholic respectively. And he thought that would sort of heal the divisions in Europe. I mean, he really believed that he could sort of reverse the Reformation, because he felt like actually there was a lot of common ground between Catholics and Protestants. Basically, if the Pope behaved himself and stopped interfering in temporal affairs, in other words, if he stopped believing he could depose kings, there was actually a lot that was kind of common between Protestants and Catholics. And so James, this whole image of a peacemaker king, attempts to kind of bring Catholics and Protestants together. We know, of course, he'd had the Hampton Court Conference. We know the New English Bible, which again was a really important means by which the power and the reputation of England was promoted abroad, particularly beyond his reign. But ironically, his children, so here is Elizabeth of Bohemia, as she became, his daughter Elizabeth, who married the Elector Frederick of the German Palatine. And to cut a very long short, basically Frederick decided to accept the crown of Bohemia, and in other words, defy the Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs. In a nutshell, sparking what became the 30 Years' War. So here was James trying to create peace in Europe. It was only his son-in-law and his daughter that in many ways catalysed this very, very violent, vicious 30 Years' War. And it was that which, I mean, the letters again from Elizabeth, the daughter, to James are amazing. I'm just trying to think who it is that's edited the collection. Can you remember her name? Yes, Nadine Ackerman. So she's a brilliant scholar who has basically edited, translated all the letters of Elizabeth Bohemian. There's loads of them. And you have letters where she's writing, Dad, what kind of father are you? You're not helping me out. You've got to help out me and, your son-in-law. But actually, and James wasn't having any of it. People at home were going, basically, come on, James, you need to go to war. He resisted. was it because he was a sort of committed peacemaker? Was it actually because he was pretty shrewd, because he knew that England had no money and we couldn't afford to go to war? And therefore, was this kind of his way of trying to kind of bluster his way through the fact that actually we had no money? But as it was, as James's life and reign drew to a close, Britain was on the cusp of joining Europe's war, and what happens becomes another story. And so, what have I tried to do in this book? Well, really bring together very disparate bits of narrative from different parts of the world, from China to Russia to Japan to India, drawing on very detailed work that other people had done and that hadn't really been put together to create this sort of new narrative of James's reign. And so I tried to see how this sort of period where Britain is emerging, Great Britain for the first time, starts to make a move on the global stage and try and extend its power to greater or lesser success. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna. I have many questions, but maybe we open the floor first and just see if people have
don't be shy,
ask.
anyone.
We've got about, I think, 15, 20 minutes. Yes, I think we've got someone back there.
How much was James's vision his own? How much was it something that he acquired when he came to England, or was it something that he developed based on his experience as the Scots monarch?
It's a very good question. It's the ultimate question, really. I mean, lots of people would say he learned a lot from his period of being King of Scotland, navigating factions. As I mentioned, he was in prison for a time. It was really dicey, and I think he had to learn to be quite pragmatic, to be a bit Machiavellian in the way that he kind of promised things to different people, navigated factions. I think, he was also a great writer. He wrote, he was smart, he was intelligent. And I think, I don't know what you think, Lauren, but I found it really hard to kind of get a sense ultimately of the man. Either he's a complete charlatan who was blagging it, and in a way, of course, his historical reputation, he's this awkward bit between the glamour of Elizabeth's reign, overrated, I would say, separate conversation, and then, of course, everything that comes with his son Charles and all of that. So his reputation is kind of been overlooked in many ways. But is he highly principled, highly intelligent, learnt from his upbringing, and in many ways a monarch ahead of his times, perhaps more politician than monarch? He didn't look to gain glory and strength for England through military means, which of course was the expectation at the time. He tried to do it through peacemaking and to some extent through trade and sort of posturing diplomatically, which is actually quite a modern way of doing it. But whether that was him blagging it or whether it was his principle or pragmatism, I don't know what you think. It's hard to say.
I think you've answered it beautifully. Sometimes I have no idea. And his attitudes to women are a bit sketchy, so getting more into kind of Jacobean women, I'm like, they didn't have an easy time, kind of, I think. But in some ways that also inspired them to kind of have their own courts and maybe, have their own pockets of power as well. So in some ways that kind of worked out well for Anne of Denmark, his wife, for example. But how much of the Jacobean era that we kind of think about is his own kind of self-fashioning is so...
Well, that's one of the things that I think is really interesting, because obviously if we talk about periods of, the Elizabethan period, and you sort of, the question is always how much of that is inspired by the monarch that gives it its name, and how much of it was everybody else. And I think in the Jacobean period, people like Sir Thomas Smith, this great kind of merchant figure, was just, his house in London, that's where it feels like that was almost an alternative court. It was where, the letters were coming back from all these different trading posts around the world. It just felt like the epicenter of lots of things. Anna of Denmark, hugely impressive, cultivated, cultured woman in her own right, who is often overlooked. And then there was, of course, and we have, I deliberately didn't talk about it in my book, which of course was, well, a little bit, the relationship with the Duke of Buckingham. But people were like, I can't believe you're not going to write anything about James, was he gay or not? You're not writing about that in your book. And even, I hadn't realised, a friend of mine sent me in the midst of writing, you can get aprons, tea towels and postcards that says James I was gay. And they're like, look, the merchandise is out there already. Are you not going to engage with this? And it's a funny one because, in a way, I don't know how much it matters. I mean, obviously, some of you might have watched the recent drama of, what was it called?
Yeah, Mary and George.
Mary and George. Yeah. And it's like, I mean, it's to something, it's the same kind of thing. When I've written Elizabeth, everyone was like, was she the Virgin Queen or not? Did she or didn't she with Robert Dudley? And we're sort of obsessed with these questions, but you sort of think, actually, did it matter? And in the same way, if James was gay, or if he wasn't gay, or if he had this very close friendship, does it matter? And I'm not sure that how much, in the case of James, it really did. And I think in many ways, politics, commerce, culture is sort of going on around him, but how much is the epicenter is really hard to say, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Is there any other? Yes.
You talked about the ambassadors going overseas, like Thomas Roe, etc. In Elizabeth's time, we had a few ambassadors from Morocco and places like that. Were there many ambassadors coming from overseas to this small little place? If they were they important people, less important people? And do we know anything about their reports and their impressions of England and Scotland?
Great question. And I'm trying to think of the Shirley brothers. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's interesting because actually there weren't like significant ambassadors that came here. I mean, I'm not sure when the first Indian ambassador came.
No, it must have been much later.
I mean, we were so unimportant. But what you did have, so Robert and Anthony Shirley, who were these brothers who, I'm just trying to think where they were, Persia. Mm-hmm. So they basically went and sort of said to the Shah of Persia, well, they were like travellers essentially, and sort of said, well, if you like, we'll kind of represent you. It was really kind of who were they working for. But they then went on a tour of Europe and then came also to England, essentially to kind of do the Shah of Persia's bidding. So, because actually, I mean, again, it speaks to the point that we were just not important enough for these countries in the East to kind of want to come and engage with us. And so these kind of upstart young English people who travelled there were like, yeah, I'll go home and do your business for you. All pretty unsuccessfully. It never really came to anything. So it was in one direction at this point, really.
Oh, okay, sorry, I can't. Yeah, if you're in the very back,
the sun
you have
is
to
so
wave
high in
because
here.
there's a very bright light in our face.
So how successful was his foreign project? What was the state of the trade at the end of his reign compared to when he started?
So how successful was his foreign policy?
Yes, and the foreign trade policy.
Well, foreign trade. Well, in different places. I mean, Lauren can talk perhaps about America a little bit and tobacco and trade because it did sort of save the colonies. In terms of the sort of other foreign policy, I mean, if he really did seek to maintain peace, then it was a disaster in the sense that then England, went to war on the continent. I would say the significant, well, I mean, again, it's, do we believe that the sort of trade that began in this period, that of course didn't come to anything in Japan, factories were established and then they were closed and came back, so that didn't really continue. In India, it was a bit of a false start. So it was, a lot of things were begun and then didn't really carry on till much later. But I suppose the exception is trade in America.
Yeah. I think the North American colonies, I think, where the plantation projects can start. I think this is, something that really comes across in your book as well, but it's, England is expanding at this time. Colonization means they are gaining these new lands.
Yeah.
And often through, as you say, very violent means, but it does create, I think James's emphasis on kind of creating a kind of little England or little Britain in other places means that the plantation is both kind of the means and the end, Yeah. And so then once you establish these plantations, there is this rush for kind of what are the lucrative commodities that we can, send to please investors back home and tobacco is the major crop in this period. Not long after James's reign, so it's just around the time of his death in 1625 that the English start colonizing islands in the Caribbean, and so sugar starts to be a huge import by the 1630s. So it's kind of on the cusp, but one thing I think your book really shows is that even though there's all these different projects and everything depends so much on location and the agents and kind of go-betweens involved, it's actually amazing how much kind of James or like the court knew as well, like how much information is actually getting to him. So it goes back to that question of kind of, how much is this a kind of conscious policy? But it does seem like James was really important for kind of getting people out and traveling, but also coming back and consolidating that information.
And Virginia became a royal colony just at the end of his reign, 1624. So I guess that was an important tipping point. Yeah. Just give us a sneak little peek into your book.
I feel like that's cheating.
No, it's not cheating. Everyone wants to hear it. Come on. So America, influence on Tudor and Stuart England. So just give us a little peek on why this is important. And
Well, again, this is something that I loved reading about in your book. I was so pleased you had a whole chapter on it wasn't just a chapter on the colonization of Virginia, it was here's what Indigenous people in Virginia did to fight the English, right? Like you have a chapter called the Powhatan Uprising, right? So, but it's a book that's kind of concerned with that similar idea of like the English are not just going out and imposing themselves on the world, all these other influences and peoples and perspectives are coming in as these borders become kind of more fluid as well. So it's an object history, so it's got 20 chapters, each follows a different object as it leaves the Americas, whether or not that's in Bolivia, where the silver mines are, or in Virginia, and it follows kind of featherwork and silver and things coming into England in this period. So yeah, I think it's a nice companion piece.
So does it
for your book.
Does it change England? Is there a sense of suddenly this sort of multicultural?
I think, for me, I think the big thing is, I think you can make the case with something like tobacco that really does change English culture. Like people are smoking, James is freaking out about it and hates it. Everyone else around him is smoking. To the extent to when he goes to visit universities and things, all the scholars beforehand are running to the different colleges telling the students, like, put your tobacco stashes away, like the king does not want to sniff it when he walks by. So he does seem to really have hated it, throughout his entire realm, his entire reign. But, so I think that's one example of like an indigenous practice that like changes England in this time period. But also things like having potatoes in your pantry and sunflowers and different kinds of parsley, who would have thought, that's actually from Virginia, but that people are now using to spice their food, so it's kind of coming into houses on a domestic level. But I think ultimately what changes is the colonial dimension, right? It's that England is becoming a colonial power for the first time, even though that power is, as you say, very weak and diffuse maybe at the beginning.
Was there a couple more?
Should we get some questions from
Were you all right?
I will.
I think there's two questions here, and then there was some already at the back, wasn't there?
Yeah, we've got, I think, one. Yeah, maybe we'll have. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one question. From what I've been hearing from this lecture, James I did some amazing things by getting Scotland, maybe Wales, and was it Wales part of the Union at the time?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he kind of created a union and cut all the countries together in Britain. And he also managed to do like peace treaties where he managed to get Britain, Protestant Britain, to coexist with Catholic Europe, and they did trades with one another coexistently. And also it gave birth of the British Empire, but there was just one thing that I thought might be a downside to him, and that was, you said something about a plantation, one of the earliest plantations, and my question is, because there was trade in that, but then there was also slavery. My only question is, did the slave trade, the British slave trade, start under James I, or was it another British monarch that did that?
It did. So there's I talk a little bit, so there are accounts of slaves being traded during, so I think 1612, I think there's some particular accounts. But so, I mean, yes, we do see slaves being traded within James's reign, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, I should also say the plantation of Ulster, which is, I mean, a whole massive thing in itself. I mean, you know, it's sort of the native Irish Catholics being just sort of driven out in order to implant, you know, settlers from Scotland and England that was seen as Protestant, and to create this kind of Britain in Ireland. Also, I mean, Londonderry was named after, you know, London companies going and investing in Ireland. So, I mean, it's you know, it's again, there's so many parts of James around the early 17th century which people sort of isn't sort of part of sort of popular understanding or discourse, but it's really significant. I mean, when we think about relations with Ireland, we really need to understand the period, you know, right back to the plantation of Ulster. I mean, similarly, it's things like, you know, the gunpowder plot and all of that, and it's, you know, kids sort of celebrate Firework Day, but, you know, just thinking, unpicking that, what was that about? And, you know, even stepping back and thinking, if that plot had succeeded, and, you know, we sort of almost rehearsed that, you know, and State Opening of Parliament was a few weeks ago, and they still ceremonially search the cellars today. Yeah, I mean, they do. They're there, 9 o'clock in the morning. They do it. But the fact is, I mean, you know, if Guy Fawkes hadn't been discovered, you know, that was the whole ruling elite, ruling establishment wiped out. I mean, I kind of don't generally like counterfactuals because they just kind of hurt my head a bit. But you do think, wow, what might have happened? I mean, if, you know, all the ruling elites, the court, judges, clergy, I mean, all significant people, all within Parliament taken out, it would have been just phenomenal. But yes, so sorry, to answer your question directly, yes, slaves were being traded during this period. And I think there's 2 questions here before we finish, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we can close with those.
Is there any reference in your book at all to any influence James's advent had on literature at the time? I'm obviously thinking about Shakespeare initially.
Yeah, I mean, Shakespeare at the beginning, because it's a very good point, because, I mean, lots of people think of Shakespeare as a kind of Elizabethan playwright, but actually most of his, or a lot of his very sort of significant plays were either written at the end of the Elizabethan period, reflecting actually on the succession crisis or potential succession crisis, or they were written in James's reign. And actually, he was one of the king's men, so he was at court as one of the king's men within the king's privy chamber, whereas under Elizabeth, he was sort of more, you know, visiting the court, so he wasn't directly part of it in the same way he was with James. So, yeah, I mean, it's not, there's other books that focus, you know, much more on Jacobean culture and literature, but he is at the first Christmas at court, where lots of the ambassadors are coming to court because they're all jockeying position to see what, you know, they all want alliances with James, and it really is this kind of like, you know, Robert Cecil's there thinking, oh my God, there's all these tensions between the French and the Spanish ambassador, where are we going to sit them and seat them and so on. And Shakespeare was there putting on some plays, and there were masks and so on. So I wanted to situate him. But yeah, I mean, again, it's just that sense that Elizabeth has cast such a shadow over this period that you kind of assume that, you know, so much of culture at the period flourished under Elizabeth, and up to a point did, but equally James's reign has a cultural flourish in it, which is important to acknowledge.
You just can't put Jacobean in a book title because
it's just not really. It doesn't. Yeah, if you put exactly,
you put Elizabethan. You
know, I know. It's so true. I think the lady there's got the last question.
I noticed on. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I noticed on one of the picture sources you showed, the one with the traders, and there were 11 people sitting around the table.
Oh, yeah.
Was that a religious representation?
Oh, no.
And how relevant was the source? Was it a specific source for the treaty that you mentioned, or was it a representation?
No, it was the Somerset House Conference, and so it's depicting the Spanish and also Spanish Netherlands negotiators with the English around the table. So it's not, 11's not sort of biblically significant, but it is a representation from the time.
Right. But it could be a representation if it was the Spanish ministers that were around, if James was trying to portray himself
I
as
see what you
a
mean,
monarch
yeah.
of both religions.
Interesting. Hadn't thought of it like that. I'll have to go back and have a look. It's an interesting thought. You're giving me some more work to do there. That's for the next edition. Thank you.
Oh, well, Anna, thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for this fascinating talk and for answering so many questions as well. I'm sure lots of you are keen to get a copy of Anna's book, so they're here for you to buy in a handy paperback edition. You can just put it in your pocket or your bag after she signs it. So do come down to get some from our independent bookseller, Fox Lane. And thank you so much for attending today's event. I hope that you'll be going to many more in the future.